The dust kicked up by Maria Redhawk's worn boots settled slowly in the stifling heat of Millbrook's Main Street. The small Arizona town, nestled between Red Canyon walls and forgotten by progress, seemed to hold its breath whenever she walked through. At 23, Maria carried herself with a dignity that defied the cruel stares that followed her everywhere she went. The scars that marked the left side of her face and neck were the result of a house fire when she was 16, a tragedy that had claimed her grandmother's life and left Maria with more than just physical reminders. The keloid tissue created raised, darker patches that caught the harsh desert sun, but it was the whispers that burned deeper than any flame ever could. "There goes the Apache girl," muttered Mrs. Henderson from behind the general store's screen door, her voice carrying the particular venom reserved for those she deemed beneath her notice. Shame what happened to her face, but I suppose it matches what's inside. Maria's jaw tightened, but she kept walking. She'd learned long ago that responding only gave them more ammunition. Her worn denim jacket hung loose over her slight frame, and her long black hair was pulled back in a practical braid that couldn't quite hide the scars that crept toward her ear. The town of Millbrook had been built on the bones of broken promises. Once, this land had belonged to her people, the Western Apache, but now it was home to barely 300 souls who seemed to find their identity in what they weren't rather than what they were. The economy had dried up with the copper mine. 15 years ago, leaving behind a community that nursed old grudges like precious water, Maria pushed through the door of Kowalski's Market, the bell announcing her arrival with a sharp ding. The conversations didn't stop this time. They simply shifted to stage whispers, designed to be heard. "I don't know why she even bothers coming into town," said Janet Morrison, a woman whose bitterness had calcified over years of disappointment. "It's not like anyone here wants to see that. Mother always said you could tell character by looking at a person," added her companion, a rail-thin woman named Beverly Kane. "Some things just can't be hidden." Maria selected her items methodically: canned beans, bread, milk, and the cheapest cut of meat old Tom Kowalski had available. She'd been coming here twice a week for 7 years, ever since she'd aged out of the foster system and moved into the small trailer on the outskirts of town. In all that time, the routine never changed. The stares, the whispers, the way people stepped aside as if her scars were contagious. At the counter, Tom Kowalski avoided eye contact as he rang up her purchases. He wasn't cruel, just weak, afraid of what his customers might say if he showed her basic human kindness. 1847, he mumbled, still looking at the register. Maria placed a $20 bill on the counter, her calloused hands steady despite the weight of their stares. She worked at the Torres Ranch, mucking stables and mending fences, jobs that kept her hands rough and her body strong. The Torreses were the only family in the county who'd hired her without hesitation, seeing her work ethic rather than her scars. As Tom made change, the bell dinged again. Maria didn't turn around, but she felt the shift in the room's energy. The whispers stopped entirely, replaced by a different kind of tension. "Afternoon, folks," came a voice she didn't recognize, deep, measured, carrying the kind of authority that made people straighten unconsciously. "I'm looking for the sheriff's office." "End of the street, past the diner," Tom replied, his voice suddenly more respectful than Maria had ever heard it. "You the new sheriff we heard about?" "That's right. Sheriff Jake Morrison. I'll be taking over for Sheriff Brennan next week." Maria risked a glance over her shoulder and saw a man in his early 30s, tall and lean, with dark hair and intelligent brown eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. His uniform was crisp, his badge bright, and there was something in his bearing that suggested he'd seen enough of the world to not be easily impressed or intimidated. More importantly, when his gaze swept the room and landed on her, it didn't linger on her scars with the mixture of pity and disgust she was used to. Instead, he simply nodded, a gesture of acknowledgement between two human beings. "Ma'am," he said politely as she gathered her groceries. "Sheriff," she replied quietly, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice as she headed for the door. She heard Janet Morrison's voice, pitched just loud enough to be heard. "Sheriff, you should know about the characters we have around here. Some people, well, they're not quite like the rest of us." Maria paused with her hand on the door handle, her shoulders tensing. This was the moment when new authority figures learned The rules of Millbrook: who belonged and who didn't, who deserved respect, and who could be safely ignored or worse. Is that so? Sheriff Morrison's voice was neutral, giving nothing away. Oh yes, Beverly Kane chimed in, emboldened. That girl there, for instance. Apache. Got those scars in a fire. But, well, some say there's more to the story. Indians and fire, you know how that goes. The silence that followed was different from before. It carried weight, like the moment before lightning strikes. Ladies, Sheriff Morrison said finally, his voice carrying a chill that made Maria turn back toward the counter. I've been a law enforcement officer for 12 years in 3 different states. In my experience, the content of someone's character isn't written on their face. It's revealed in how they treat others. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Maria felt something unfamiliar stir in her chest. Hope, maybe, or just the novel experience of having someone speak up for her without being asked. She walked home as the sun began its descent toward the canyon walls, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that matched the dust under her feet. The sheriff's words echoed in her mind, and for the first time in years, she wondered if things in Millbrook might be capable of change. But Maria Redhawk had learned not to trust in the kindness of strangers. She'd been disappointed too many times, hurt too deeply. Still, as she unlocked the door to her small trailer, she found herself thinking about intelligent brown eyes that had looked at her and seen a person, not a collection of scars and stereotypes. Outside, the desert wind picked up, carrying with it the promise of a storm. 3 weeks later, Maria had almost convinced herself that the new sheriff was no different from the rest of them. She'd seen him around town, handling the minor disputes and traffic violations that made up most law enforcement in Millbrook, but their paths hadn't crossed again. She told herself it was better that way. Expecting nothing meant avoiding disappointment. The morning started like any other. Maria was in the feed store, loading 50-pound bags of grain into her truck for the Torres Ranch, when she heard the commotion outside. Raised voices, the kind of anger that seemed to feed on itself, growing louder and more dangerous with each passing moment. Through the window, she could see a crowd gathering in the town square. At the center of it was Billy Hendricks, a man whose 28 years had been marked by unemployment, drinking, and a growing resentment toward anyone he could blame for his failures. He was shouting something about taking back our town and not letting outsiders tell us how to live. Maria's stomach clenched. In her experience, when men like Billy started talking about outsiders, they were usually looking at her. "You hear that?" asked Pete Sullivan, the feed store owner, craning his neck to see better. "Sounds like Billy's got himself worked up about something again." Maria hefted another bag of grain, trying to focus on her work and ignore the growing noise outside. But when she heard her name shouted across the square, she knew avoiding the situation was no longer an option. That Apache girl. Billy's voice carried clearly through the morning air. Walking around like she owns this place, taking jobs from decent folks, making children scared with that face of hers. The crowd, maybe 20 people, was growing bolder, feeding off Billy's anger and their own long-simmered prejudices. Maria recognized most of them. The chronically unemployed, the perpetually angry, the ones who needed someone to blame for their own shortcomings. "Someone should do something about her," shouted Carl Brennan, the former sheriff's nephew, a man who'd inherited his uncle's badge of authority but none of his restraint. "Make her understand she's not welcome here." Maria set down the grain bag and walked to the window, her heart hammering against her ribs. This wasn't just talk anymore. She could see it in their faces, the way they were looking toward the feed store. They knew she was here. Pete Sullivan stepped back from the window, his face pale. "Maria, maybe you should wait this out in the back room." But waiting had never solved anything. Maria had learned that the hard way. In foster homes where hiding only made things worse. In schools where silence was taken as admission of guilt. She straightened her shoulders and walked toward the door. "Don't," Pete whispered urgently. "They're all worked up. Just stay inside until they move on." Maria paused with her hand on the door handle. "And then what, Pete? Tomorrow they'll be more worked up. Next week, they'll be throwing rocks. When does it end?" She pushed through the door and stepped into the morning sunlight. The crowd turned toward her like a pack sensing prey, and the noise died down to a dangerous murmur. Billy Hendricks stood at the front, his face flushed with alcohol and anger. His fists clenched at his sides. "There she is," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden quiet. "The Apache girl who thinks she's better than us, taking our jobs, scaring our kids." "I work at the Torres Ranch," Maria said quietly, her voice steady despite the fear racing through her veins. "I don't take anyone's job. I earn my own way." "Earn?" Billy laughed, a harsh sound that encouraged the crowd. "With that face? What kind of earning you doing out there?" The implication hit her like a physical blow, but Maria kept her expression neutral. She'd heard worse, survived worse. Words were just noise until you let them inside your head. "I muck stables and mend fences," she said. "Same as anyone else. Would do. Same as anyone else." Carl Brennan stepped forward, his chest puffed out with borrowed authority. "You ain't the same as anyone else. Look at you, you're marked. Some people say that fire was justice catching up to your family." The crowd murmured agreement, emboldened by Carl's words. Someone, Maria couldn't see who, picked up a handful of dust and threw it in her direction. It fell short, but the gesture was clear. "My grandmother died in that fire," Maria said, her voice carrying clearly across the square. "She was trying to save our photo albums, the only pictures we had of my grandfather and great-grandfather. She died protecting our family history." "Indian history," spat Janet Morrison, who had appeared at the edge of the crowd. "Nothing but trouble and violence. Look what it got her, look what it got you." More people were gathering now, drawn by the spectacle. Maria saw faces she recognized from the grocery store, the diner, the gas station. People who had served her with reluctant politeness were now part of a mob that seemed to be deciding what to do with her. Billy Hendricks stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the whiskey on his breath. "Maybe it's time you understood that you're not wanted here. Maybe it's time you moved on." "This is my home," Maria said quietly. "I was born here. My family has been here for generations before this town existed." "Your family?" Billy's voice rose to a shout. "Your people lost. This is our land now, and we decide who stays and who goes." He reached out as if to grab her arm, his face twisted with an anger that had been building for weeks, maybe years. Maria stepped back, but the crowd had formed a loose circle around her. There was nowhere to go. That's when she heard it. The steady clip-clop of horse hooves on asphalt, an unusual sound in a town where everyone drove pickup trucks or beat-up sedans. The crowd turned, confused, as Sheriff Jake Morrison rode into the town square on a beautiful chestnut mare, his uniform crisp despite the dust, his expression calm but alert. He dismounted smoothly and walked through the crowd, which parted reluctantly. Before him, his hand rested casually on his service weapon, but his posture was relaxed, almost conversational. "Morning, folks," he said pleasantly. "Beautiful day, isn't it? Though I have to say, when I heard there was a disturbance in the town square, I expected something more serious than 20 adults surrounding one young woman." Billy Hendricks straightened, trying to recover his authority. "Sheriff, this don't concern you. We're just having a community discussion about community standards." "Community standards," Sheriff Morrison repeated thoughtfully. He looked around, the circle of faces, his gaze lingering on each person just long enough to make them uncomfortable. "And what standards would those be exactly?" "Standards about who belongs here," Carl Brennan said, stepping forward. "About maintaining the character of our town." Sheriff Morrison nodded slowly, as if considering this seriously. Then he walked directly to Maria, stopping beside her in the center of the circle. The crowd shifted nervously, uncertain how to react to this development. "Miss?" he said, looking at her with those same intelligent brown eyes she remembered from the grocery store. "Red Hawk," she said quietly. "Maria Red Hawk. Miss Red Hawk, have you broken any laws today?" The question was asked loud enough for everyone to hear. Maria shook her head. "No, sir. Have you threatened anyone, damaged any property, or disturbed the peace?" "No, sir." Sheriff Morrison turned back to the crowd, his expression still pleasant, but his voice carrying new authority. "Then I'm curious about what crime you all think she's committed that justifies this community discussion." The silence stretched uncomfortably. Finally, Billy Hendricks found his voice again. "She don't belong here, Sheriff. People like her, Sheriff Morrison interrupted, his voice cutting through Billy's words like a blade. "Are American citizens with the same rights as everyone else in this square. including the right to walk through town without being surrounded by an angry mob. He extended his hand toward Maria, palm up, an invitation rather than a command. "Miss Redhawk, would you like me to escort you to your vehicle?" Maria stared at his outstretched hand for a moment, hardly believing what she was seeing. In 7 years of living in Millbrook, no one, not one single person, had ever publicly taken her side. And now this man, this sheriff who barely knew her, was offering his protection in front of the entire town. She placed her hand in his, feeling the warmth and strength of his grip, and together they walked through the crowd toward her truck. The silence was absolute now, heavy with shock and the weight of a challenge that had been issued and accepted. As they reached her truck, Sheriff Morrison spoke quietly, his voice meant only for her. "Are you all right?" Maria nodded, not trusting her voice. His hand was still holding hers, and she was amazed by how normal it felt. How right. When was the last time someone had touched her without flinching, without pity, without fear? "This won't be the end of it," she said finally, looking back at the crowd that was beginning to disperse, their faces sullen with frustrated anger. "No," he agreed. "It probably won't, but it's a beginning." He helped her into the truck, his hand briefly, touching her shoulder in a gesture of support that felt like a promise. As she drove away, Maria caught sight of him in her rearview mirror, still standing in the town square, watching the crowd break up with the calm authority of a man who had chosen his side and was prepared to stand by it. For the first time in years, Maria Redhawk allowed herself to hope. The story of what happened in the town square spread through Millbrook like wildfire in dry grass. By evening, everyone knew that the new sheriff had publicly defended the Apache girl, had taken her hand and walked her through the crowd like she was somebody who mattered. Maria sat on the small porch of her trailer, listening to the desert wind and thinking about the warmth of Jake Morrison's hand in hers. She'd replayed the moment a dozen times, trying to understand what it meant, trying not to read too much into a simple act of human decency. But she couldn't forget the way he'd looked at the crowd, the quiet authority in his voice when he defended her rights. No one had ever done that before. No one had ever seen her as worth defending. The phone rang inside her trailer, an old landline that barely worked most days. Maria rarely received calls, so the sound was startling in the evening quiet. She let it ring twice before answering. "Hello, Maria? It's Rosa Torres." Rosa Torres was the wife of her employer, a kind woman who had always treated Maria with respect. But there was something different in her voice now, a tension that made Maria's stomach clench. "Mrs. Torres, is everything all right?" "That's what I'm calling to ask you, Mija. Miguel heard about what happened in town today. Are you hurt?" "I'm fine," Maria said, surprised by the concern in the older woman's voice. "The sheriff, he handled it." "Yes, I heard about that too." Rosa paused, and Maria could hear her husband's voice in the background, speaking rapid Spanish. "Listen, Maria, Miguel thinks. We think maybe you should stay away from town for a while. Let things cool down." Maria closed her eyes, feeling something cold settle in her chest. "Are you firing me, Mrs. Torres?" No, Mija, never that. You're the best worker we've ever had." But Miguel is worried. Some of his friends in town, they're saying things about people who support, about people who defend. She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. Maria understood. Even the Torreses, who had been kind to her, who had given her work when no one else would, were afraid of being associated with her now. "I understand," Maria said quietly. "I'll stay away from town." After hanging up, Maria sat in the growing darkness and tried to make sense of what was happening. One act of kindness from a stranger had somehow made her situation worse, not better. The people who had merely tolerated her before now saw her as a threat, as someone who might have allies, who might not be as powerless as they'd assumed. 3 miles away, Jake Morrison was having his own difficult conversation. He sat across from Mayor Patricia Whitmore in her cluttered office, listening to her explain why his actions that morning had been problematic for the town. "I understand your position, Sheriff," Mayor Whitmore was saying, her voice carefully reasonable. "And I appreciate your commitment to equal treatment under the law. But you have to understand the delicate balance we maintain here." Jake leaned back in his chair, studying the mayor's face. Patricia Whitmore was in her 50s, a woman who had built her political career on avoiding controversy and keeping everyone just happy enough to avoid real conflict. She wasn't evil, just weak, the kind of person who enabled injustice through inaction rather than malice. What balance would that be exactly, he asked. Jake, may I call you Jake? Millbrook is a small town. We all have to live together, work together. Sometimes that means accommodating different viewpoints, even when we don't personally agree with them. Different viewpoints about what? Mayor Whitmore shifted uncomfortably. About who belongs here. About maintaining community harmony. Jake stood up, walking to the window that looked out over the town square where, 12 hours earlier, he'd taken Maria Redhawk's hand and challenged everything this community had quietly agreed to accept. Mayor Whitmore, he said without turning around, I took an oath when I became a law enforcement officer. I swore to protect and serve all citizens equally, regardless of race, religion, or any other factor. That includes Maria Redhawk. Of course, but there are ways to do that without making such a public statement, without inflaming tensions. Now Jake did turn around, his expression serious. The tensions were already inflamed. I saw 20 adults surrounding one young woman in your town square. If I hadn't intervened, what do you think would have happened next? Mayor Whitmore's silence was answer enough. I've read the files, Jake continued. Maria Redhawk has never been arrested, never caused any trouble. She works hard, pays her taxes, keeps to herself. The only thing she's guilty of is being born Apache in a town that's decided Apache people don't belong. It's not that simple. It's exactly that simple. Jake's voice carried the kind of finality that ended conversations. As long as I'm sheriff of this town, Maria Redhawk has the same rights as everyone else. Anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me directly. As Jake left the mayor's office, he was already planning his next move. He'd meant what he said about defending Maria's rights, but he also understood that good intentions weren't enough. In a town like Millbrook, change required more than just words. It required persistent, visible action. The next morning, Jake Morrison did something that had never been done in the 60-year history of Millbrook. He drove to the outskirts of town and knocked on Maria Redhawk's door. Maria opened it cautiously, still wearing the clothes she'd slept in, her long hair loose around her shoulders. She looked surprised and wary, as if expecting this kindness to come with conditions she wouldn't like. Sheriff Morrison, is something wrong? Call me Jake, he said, offering a smile that seemed to ease some of the tension from her face. And, no, nothing's wrong. I was wondering if you'd like to have breakfast in town. Maria stared at him as if he'd suggested they fly to the moon. Breakfast? In town, at Murphy's Diner. I hear they make good pancakes. Sheriff, Jake, I don't think that's a good idea. After yesterday, Jake said gently, I think it's exactly what needs to happen. You have every right to eat breakfast in that diner, and I have every right to eat breakfast with whomever I choose. Maria looked down at herself, suddenly conscious of her appearance. I'm not dressed for town. You look fine, he said, and something in his voice made her believe he meant it. But take your time. I'll wait. 20 minutes later, Maria emerged from her trailer wearing her best jeans and a blue blouse that brought out the color of her eyes. She'd braided her hair carefully, but she couldn't hide the scars, couldn't change the fact that walking into Murphy's Diner with the sheriff would cause a sensation that the town would talk about for years. Are you sure about this? She asked as they walked toward his patrol car. I'm sure, he said, opening the passenger door for her with the kind of old-fashioned courtesy that made her feel like a lady rather than a burden. The question is, are you? Maria thought about Rosa Torres's phone call, about the crowd in the town square, about 7 years of being treated like she was invisible or dangerous or both. Then she thought about the warmth of Jake's hand in hers, the way he'd looked at her like she was worth defending. Yes, she said, settling into the passenger seat. I'm sure. As Jake and Maria drive into town for breakfast, they know their outing is more than a meal. It's a quiet act of defiance that challenges Millbrook's deep-rooted prejudice. Their arrival at Murphy's Diner shocks the townsfolk, and whispers quickly turn to open judgment. Despite the tension, Jake remains calm and supportive, treating Maria as an equal, even as stares and muttered insults surround them. When Carl Brennan, emboldened by alcohol and old biases, tries to provoke a confrontation, Jake stands up, publicly and firmly, declaring that Maria has every right to be there and that harassment will not be tolerated under his watch, his unwavering support catches Maria off guard. She's used to people backing down when challenged, but Jake doesn't. He simply returns to his pancakes, telling her he's doing this because it's right, and because she deserves better. In that moment, Maria begins to believe change might be possible, not just in Millbrook, but in herself. And though she warns Jake of the consequences, he answers simply, "Some things are worth the risk." As they finish their breakfast, the diner gradually returned to its normal rhythm, though the conversations remained muted and the glances in their direction continued. When Jake asked for the check, Dolores Murphy approached their table with obvious reluctance. "Sheriff," she said quietly, "I don't want any trouble in my place." "There won't be any trouble, Dolores," Jake replied. "Not as long as everyone remembers that all customers are welcome here." He paid the check and left a generous tip, then stood and offered Maria his arm with the kind of old-fashioned gallantry that turned a simple gesture into a statement. As they walked toward the door, Jake nodded pleasantly to the room at large. "Have a good day, folks," he said. "Beautiful morning, isn't it?" Outside, the desert sun was climbing toward its midday intensity, but there was a breeze carrying the scent of rain from the distant mountains. Jake walked Maria to his patrol car, opening the door for her with the same courtesy he'd shown inside. "Where to?" he asked as he settled behind the wheel. "The Torres Ranch," Maria said automatically, then hesitated. Unless this has caused problems for them too." Jake started the engine and pulled out onto the main street, driving slowly through the town center where people had gathered on sidewalks to watch them pass. "I think," he said thoughtfully, "that it's time for me to pay the Torreses a visit. Official sheriff business, you understand. Just to make sure everyone understands that you're under my protection." The word protection hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that neither of them was quite ready to name. But as they drove through the streets of Millbrook, past the staring faces and whispered conversations, Maria felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the possibility that she might not have to face the world alone. That evening, as the sun set behind the canyon walls and painted the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Jake Morrison made another unprecedented decision. He drove back to Maria's trailer, not in his patrol car this time, but in his personal truck, carrying a bottle of wine and the courage to ask a question that had been building in his mind all day. Maria answered the door in bare feet and a simple sundress, her hair loose around her shoulders, the scars on her neck and face visible in the soft light from her porch lamp. She looked surprised to see him, but not displeased. "Jake, is everything all right?" "Everything's fine," he said, suddenly nervous in a way he hadn't been since high school. "I was wondering, would you like to have dinner with me?" "Not in town," he added quickly. "I was thinking maybe we could cook something here, if that's all right with you." After the public confrontation in the town square and the quiet but powerful act of sharing breakfast at Murphy's Diner with the new sheriff, Jake Morrison, Maria Redhawk begins to understand that something fundamental has shifted in her life, and perhaps in the town of Millbrook itself. For years, she had moved through the streets as a ghost, enduring stares, whispers, and the silent agreement that she did not belong. But when Jake stood beside her, hand in hand, and faced down the town's bitterness without flinching, he did more than offer protection. He disrupted a pattern that had gone unchallenged for far too long. His unwavering courage in the face of hostility didn't just spark tension, it cracked the surface of Millbrook's long-held prejudices. In that moment, Maria realized that she was no longer completely alone, and that perhaps, just perhaps, change was not only possible, but already beginning. Despite backlash and quiet threats, Jake stands firm. He visits Maria at her trailer, bringing wine and a quiet invitation for something more than protection. They share a simple meal and honest conversation. In each other, they find something unexpected, mutual respect, growing trust, and the beginnings of something deeper. In the days that followed, the town of Millbrook simmered in a quiet but undeniable tension. The air felt heavier somehow, charged with unspoken opinions, whispered conversations behind drawn curtains, and sideways glances exchanged across church pews and grocery aisles. The town remained divided, its old wounds now dragged into the light. For some, the sight of Maria Redhawk walking freely through the streets, no longer shrinking beneath stares, was intolerable. The hostility didn't vanish overnight. It lingered in muttered comments, in tight-lipped nods, in the sudden silences that fell when she entered a room. There were those who clung more tightly than ever to their prejudices, rattled by the challenge. To a system they'd never questioned. But something else began to stir, too. Some townspeople began to quietly question their old prejudices as they watched Sheriff Jake Morrison stand beside Maria Redhawk with quiet strength and dignity. He didn't seek attention or make speeches. He simply walked with her, hand in hand, unashamed. Together, their presence challenged Millbrook's past and forced the town to reflect on who it truly was and who it wanted to become. For the first time in years, Maria feels hope, not because the world has changed overnight, but because she's no longer alone. With Jake beside her, she has a voice. Together, they begin to reshape Millbrook, one act of courage at a time. Maria Redhawk wasn't destroyed by fire. She became it.